people do not on their comparative. And there are a few reasons why this is true. One, oftentimes when you are going to university, it is structurally hard to take a gender studies class, either because of the bias and stigma associated with it, or because of the fact that you need to be able to fulfill your graduation requirements. And these are often quite harsh, especially if you're a student in a more demanding field like engineering or computer science, or if you're a student in a country like the UK, where if you study one particular thing, you only study that thing and you don't get the opportunity to study things like political theory and political literature. Like, I'm pretty sure we all know what this looks like. But secondarily, a lot of moderate people on the middle do not take these particular classes because they have to, in their university degree, work towards a particular career or a particular endpoint. And that means they don't have the time to be able to take a lot of these classes. But third, oftentimes a lot of the people who do take these classes in the first place are already feminists who are majoring in this particular thing, or rather. But fourth, the pre-existing stigma and bias that they will say exists is the very reason why you're unlikely to take this in the first place. One piece of preemption then. Look, even if there are bigots on both sides of the house, and I want to be very clear about this, there are enforcement mechanisms for punishing people who are sexist in seminars or who propagate awful narratives. So if all wants to run this claim, be advised, like the game theoretic incentive for you not to want to get expelled because you say some sexist shit in a general class. Claim one then. Why do we get far more discourse, and why is this discourse good on our side of the house? A few pieces of characterization here. One, why is it good and uniquely good to do this in an academic environment? The structural reason for this is oftentimes the way we engage in feminist narratives and literature outside of academia is very unnuanced and very poor. It is portrayed by sensationalist media. It is portrayed by films and TV shows that are often not complex. They don't dive into feminist ideas in a good and meaningful and convincing way. Before I go on, I'll take closing.
Yeah, should curricula also include things like issues of minority groups, of LGBT people? Where do you draw the line?
Yeah, this is broadly a good thing. I think feminist literature is particularly important insofar as women are half the fucking population, and thus the narratives and norms that apply to them are very salient and very relevant. Why is it good that people are exposed to feminist narratives and ideas? One, because oftentimes women in these classes feel valued or heard and represented among literature that is structurally overwhelmingly male. But two, a lot of moderates get exposure to ideas they previously hadn't considered and develop a more nuanced and good or particularly a complex view of the world, which informs their preferences more. It means they vote more accurately in line with their preferences. It means they also become understand issues to a greater complex depth. How do people internalize this? Why do they internalize this? Well, one, it is propagated from people in positions of authority that you trust, like your professors and seminar leaders. Two, people who take these types of general courses in university generally enter university with a somewhat open mind, i.e. they want to hear different issues. It's why they go to university in the first place. But third, note that the way in which these classes are often structured is they're structured to provide discourse and discussion about literature and narratives and ideas. Rumen.
Why in a woke liberal setting do we care about exposure if everyone is woke and understand this stuff anyway? Why do they need a huge understanding?
Right? Everyone is not woke and everyone is not liberal. A lot of young people from different backgrounds are not woke or are moderates or are conservatives. Why is it the case that people, when they interact with this particular thing, gain nuanced appreciations of this, even if they're already woke? One, the fact that you are being exposed to high quality literature at the very top level that is very analytically compelling, as opposed to the dog shit you see online propagated by mainstream media, means that even if you are already a feminist, you understand your ideas to a more nuanced extent. Even if you would never take a gender studies course because you believe you're already a good feminist or good at this particular thing, you gain a more nuanced understanding of feminism. But fifth, oftentimes this discussion and discourse happens at a very formative time in your life. The time you spend in college often gives you the worldview that you build up for the rest of your life. And the impact of this is very simple. One, we get better feminists who understand the opposition to their views more, because this is also discussed in class per my framing. But two, people who are moderates and people who are conservatives gain more nuanced and more deep understanding of feminist narratives and views, and thus they respect feminists more, they listen to their ideas more, they're more open to them when they see them, and this is an a priori good. Franka will expand on why it is good. I've done my job. Happy to win. OG.
Thank the PM. Call on the yellow.
Oop. You can hear me? Perfect. Thanks. The most salient work of academics often occurs outside of the classroom. And the most important work they can do inside the classroom is when people believe that their course that they are carrying out is actually good for them. One piece of framing before I go into substantive, which is to say that this is, I think, something which actually all teams could agree on quite comfortably, is that what this looks like on their side of the house is not having courses which you can opt into. Like if you're studying politics, you can do a gender module in like one of your last years of university. It means putting this sort of stuff into your first years of university, which means everybody has to do this. Their benefits are contingent on this, so I think they'll probably agree to it, but it becomes important later on in the case. With this said, our claim is simple. We generally uplift female and feminist academics, which means that we're able to have greater policy advice, greater feminist leaders, and also better courses. There are three broad strands of mechanization for this claim. The first is staffing, which is to say, if you set up a gender studies department or you have gender-based courses, you need to hire professors, you need to have teaching assistants, this sort of stuff. As a result, you need to bring in people, as opposed to on their side of the house, where you continue to have people who can teach a module within their broader course. We think that the people who continue to teach politics or any other thing within their side of the house is likely to be a male professor. We think that this is the case for three broad reasons why most professors are likely to be men. The first is you just have less care responsibilities, which means you're more able to pursue a job which is, in many cases, just a passion project where it takes a very long time in order to get money. And also it requires an enormous amount of work in order to get anywhere because you need to publish or perish, right? It means you need to continually be pumping out papers. The second reason is implicit bias, which is to see that you were just seen as better if you were a man, you were seen as smarter for a variety of different ways. We are inculcated that men are better at like academics, you have greater role modeling when you're younger, you have the like stereotypical image of a professor is like some old dude with white hair and like a chalkboard, right? Like it's not like the image of something else, which means you're more likely to implicitly support this. The third thing to say is you've better access to resources and studying materials from a young age. If you are guys, generally, this is just empirically true, but also the analytical reason is because men were often afforded better opportunities in the past. It was a safe investment to give your sorts of support and work and help to boys within your household as opposed to girls. We think that the implication then is you have the same professor, no thank you, who's teaching IR and teaching the feminist part, no thank you, of the political science course on their side of the house or the economics course and whatnot. We think that on our side of the house, though, this does not have to happen. You have to hire women. There are two broad reasons for this, why you hire a female professor for a gender studies course. First is just optics. It looks terrible if you have a man standing up at the top of a room, like mansplaining to all the women about how they feel, right? Like that's just like probably engenders the sort of backlash which is framed by the PM. The second thing to say is that you've perceived epistemic authority as a woman, which would increase the quality of your research, which is to say, there's a very big difference between me understanding what like getting harassed in the street or getting like catcalled is and actually having been catcalled, right? Which is to say that you can better integrate your understanding of patriarchy into your teachings if you have daily experience with it. The implication of this is you just have more female professors on our side of the house. The second thing to say is you have greater network ties. I want to do a little bit of framing here because we kind of agree with OG, which is for the sorts of people who opt into these courses, they likely already care about feminism initially because this job is not, or this course is not immediately employable. Like, I don't know exactly what you do with gender studies exactly afterwards. Perhaps you move into the sorts of things we're going to talk about, like policy advice, like academia. No, thank you. But we think that it's often seen as just doing it for the sake of you enjoying it. As a result, then, we think that the mechanism here is as follows. We think that you create a training ground for future researchers and academics and also people within social movements more generally here. The reason for this is because people who are already passionate now get resources, which is to say they're able to speak with top leading academics and like read their papers. They have greater access to like oversight from people who are already established within feminist fields. You're able to like get funding to work on research projects which have to do with feminism. The implication of this is a fewfold. The first is that there's a low burden impact of just catharsis, right? Because you get to meet other people who are like you and you're able to discuss the things which interest you consistently. But also additionally to this, you give high degrees of like academic access to these women. So you give them the right sort of like academized language, you give them like the sorts of things that will appeal to people who are upper middle class. This is particularly important because given that these people who are opting into these courses are already very passionate. They're likely to continue that passion long term, especially when they study it and they latch their professionalism to it. This means that it is quite likely these sorts of people are the ones who go into social movements and end up being at the front of them, or end up being politicians pushing for women's rights at the point at which you have a degree which you can fall back on, at the point at which you look more legitimate off the back of that, at the point where you have the language which is able to blend in with those who are more elitist and have better opportunities. No, thank you. You're more likely to be able to succeed. We think the comparative for them, actually there's two things to, the comparative for them is they might say that like you could just study like politics or economics or whatnot anyways. We think there's two reasons why this is better for us. One is that you have more access to other people who have similar interests to you, which give you network connections to the future. But secondly, this is just an easier course to get into, which means more people can go into it. Given that I've framed that as probably like low demand for this compared to like an economics course because it's less employable, that means you have more women being able to actually get in the first instance and put this on their CV. Before I move on to the third strand of recognition, CG, go.
Yeah, so the problem with gender departments is that they're pretty small, so the staff spaces are also quite limited. Comparatively, integration into the mainstream means that feminists can work anywhere. The opportunities we afford them are far more.
Yeah, we frame why it's unlikely that those feminist professors get to work in those other fields. So even if it's a small delta in many different departments across the entirety of the world, you have literally hundreds more feminist academics able to work. The third reason is research funding. Notice in the status quo, feminist studies projects often aren't given a lot of money. The reason for this is because men run these departments as previously framed, which is to say you have a smaller epistemic slice into what it is like to be a woman as opposed to what it is like to be somebody who maybe like grew up in the Balkans and wants to look into IOR or like the fall of Yugoslavia as a research project. As a result, then you are more likely to prioritize this. For women, they are you literally just have to give them funding as a department in the university. That's the way the universities work. They like break up their funding by department, which is to say you literally just have money which you're able to put into these sorts of research projects. What are the impacts of this case generally? Two things. Firstly, you have more quality courses and information, which is to say you have better professors who are, because there's more competition and more feminist professors, which means you have better courses people actually want to opt into and people actually want to learn from. Additionally to this, we think that you're likely to just create the media through like disseminating your own insights, maybe through like social media channels or online, which comes prior to opening government. The second thing is just greater policy advice. We have more people who are able to be brought in to consult on things like this, which is very good when you're making things like domestic, like wage working policies and stuff like that. For all these reasons, opening opposition. Thank you.
Thank DLO. Call on DPM.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
In 3, 2, 1. Before I go into the framing and then into which kind of people go into the university and why is it so important to actually teach all of them something about feminism, to get the idea mainstream and thereby get more funding for these kind of departments, get the discussion going and teach people the basic principles that underline their thought to even try and relate to you being catcalled or doing these kind of things. I want to point out one particular thing, which is that the OG does, or which is that LO doesn't take any form of POI. If Rumen wants to beat us in DLO with a hung case, I'm just going to point out that is really, really not in the way that debating works. Let's start. I already told Arjun that he needed to do some framing because otherwise it was going to be apparent that no one here had taken any form or course on feminism or really took and read into it, because this is not how feminism works. So let's actually try, as the woman who started with these kind of things and how they work. The way that you integrate feminist papers isn't to do the form of explaining what catcalling is, because it's an academic institution. So we're not going to read 500 papers about how you can catcall someone and what that makes me feel. Usually the form that this happens is that in every lecture, you also get a perspective, not just purely on everything that bell hooks wrote, but for example, on how particularly women were affected in the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina in forms of transitional justice. Or that when you have economics courses, you also look at how particularly these works in Afghanistan and household differences and why an entire labor market of women is unemployed. And in all these kind of forms, you integrate these kind of classes. This is important for two reasons, and it works as a rebuttal to LO. One, the way that this is kind of, that they say that this is going to create some form of backlash or people don't want to read into this is probably overrated, because a lot of people have a bias against feminism or against what they think feminist things are. But then when they actually read that paper, realize that it's not that bad of or big of a deal, or you might not even realize that what you're reading is actually a feminist paper, which happens a lot when you get these things to it. But the second form of rebuttal here is that they say, oh, it's going to be bad because you can't let women teach these courses. I'm really unsure why the second lecture in a this series of courses can't be taught by women if you really care, because all my feminist courses or all my feminist papers were taught by women, and then the next course was given by a man. I'm really unsure whether that's true. But the third thing is that they say now somehow all these people will meet their own people if we create these magically funded small institutions that everyone can meet everyone. I don't think this is how it works for a couple reasons. One, there is a lot of bias against feminist courses and the kind of person you need to be in order to go to these kind of institutions or the moment you go there. I think Arjun made this illustration quite well, and it was entirely ignored, which is a lot of people are not particularly fond of feminism, or they might have a bias of it, but they're not really harsh bigots against it either. But it does make the barrier to go in towards these kind of places, meet your like-minded peers, and actually find it interesting very high, which means that I, as a person who was really interested in feminism, didn't go to the gender classes school because there was a stereotype on it and I thought I wouldn't fit in. But second, because I think that a lot of other moderates who go into these kind of departments don't go, that means that usually my biases when those institutions are separate are also approved, because only the people who are really radically fond of these kind of things go to those places. Because of that, and because of departments are usually dependent on university-wide funding, and nobody likes them because only the diehards go there, they don't get the funding that OO wants themselves. So that is how all these kind of things don't work. What do you get under our side of the house? First of all, I think that when you integrate feminist perspectives into normal literature, you quite do so on a nuanced way. Arjun says we have a good incentive for this. The two good incentives for this is that every department usually wants people about a particular topic to write more research papers, so they're not going to go for the most aggressive or for the harshest one, because it's just going to shoot them in the foot itself. But a second thing is also know that not all universities are woke, but most universities want everyone to educate on different forms and principles and different ideas. So the likelihood is that they try and keep a balance themselves. Where the line is, Chris, is probably something in the middle, and what the tide is at the moment. I'm going to come back in that later. Why is this so important? Because there's three kinds of people that go and want to take these courses. The first are people who are that go and want to read these papers. You take the course on geography because you're interested in geography, and you can't convince me that someone who's interested in feminism and feminism alone won't also like geography. That means that there's people who already like this a lot of people who wouldn't take it otherwise because there's a stigma on these kind of courses, because they don't have the time, because engineering is really hard, or because they're just generally disinterested and they can't be bothered to look up where the feminist courses are. And then there's the bigots. I think it's very easy to say that bigots are going to be bigots anyway on either side of the house, and I'm really unsure where the delta is going to be on that one. But I think for the majority of people, just getting to read that first feminist course, getting to experience the thought that lies behind feminism in general, getting to experience what the underlying principles were that Simone de Beauvoir wrote on, and why it is so interesting or why it is so important that you ask the other person about their experience in being catcalled, that you ask all other women to ask about how their experience as a woman is something that I think is important. It might not be the first thing on their mind, but the fact that they are familiar with this kind of literature, I think, is really important, because the next time you're on the street and you as a woman were very interested in these courses, you can ask them about it. You can talk to them about it. You can discuss the fundamentals and the basics of this idea. On their side, they might get more in-depth literature, but I'm not sure why the discussion on feminism will be better with a very small crowd that is very deeply read into it versus a bigger crowd that can get the public discussion going. Before I go on, closing. Opening, you didn't give us anything.
Yeah, this is a question for you and for opening up as well. Given that most people do this kind of thing at the level of postgrad or master's, why do you need this for undergrads?
I don't think that a lot of people do this for postgrad unless they are very, very interested. And I think in undergrad, a lot of people who start building their own thoughts and perceptions should be introduced that there is a feminist perspective to the world. You asked me before why feminism and not other things. I'm saying, well, maybe also other things, but I think usually feminism, because it hits 50% of the population, is more interesting and easily accessible and comprehensible for people to be taught as something that is slightly controversial to their male-dominant mainstream view, and all the other ones are even more niche, but it's also easy and a more accessible way, because a lot of feminist perspectives and a lot of feminist philosophies have lines and ties towards all the other views that can potentially stimulate people to take it on further there as well. So I'm happy to say that that is the reason why we're introducing people with the feminist kind of literature in their mainstream courses. Why is the forwarding of the public discussion in universities on feminism so important, and why should everyone read the basics of it? I get we don't get specialization, but I think the reason why is because because even when not all students like these courses or they don't always agree, the fact you talk about it means that students who do really like these courses also get the perspectives on why other people don't like them, and thereby get to improve their own arguments, or thereby get to improve their own literature, their own research, and their own thoughts. Because feminism isn't exclusively something that academia does, but in academia it's often treated as such, I think that it is important to also take that into the public discussion or teach it at an undergrad level, because that is the discussion where it influences people's thoughts and decisions in the future. We should take it out of all the books and out of all the specified courses and into your mainstream ideas, because that is how you're going to think about it the next time you work at an engineering force and you think how people or how women in your own work field are affected. For all these reasons, I'm so proud to study government.
Thank the DPM. Call on the DLO.
Hi, am I audible? Great. POS in the chat. I'll take 1530 from CG. Maybe I'll take OG. Who knows? Well, I don't have a degree in feminism. I have a girlfriend for 6 years, and let me tell you, she taught me a lot how to respect women and things like that. Broadly speaking, this is going to be the main response which I'm going to give to opening government. Because what is the opening government endpoint of their case? You know X% more about feminism. If the bar is already high for the people who are opting into these courses, then this benefit is super, super minimal in terms of this, which is the first way I'm going to respond. Here are reasons as to why this is the case. First reason, we are in a post-Me Too world in 2024, where feminism is a pretty mainstream thing. Celebrities, politicians are open feminists. They talk about these issues in interviews. Women are 50% of the population. They talk about this on social media. They discuss this with their male colleagues and things like that. We live in an information age. Many people have access to these sort of things and understand it. Secondly, people generally know about these things. Most people have had a girlfriend. Some people have a sister. Many people have moms. Many people have female friends. They, in general, have communicated or witnessed acts of sexism, speaking out against these type of women. How do you say? Maybe in certain cases, even more violent things that I won't get into, but people broadly understand these type of things. Thirdly reason is that, and I know this is kind of stock analysis, but it's true. If you are middle class, if you are comparatively more wealthy, the more liberal you are. Because if you are poor, that's the moment when you are, susceptible to patriarchy, chauvinism, and these type of things. The richer you are, the more time you have to educate yourself, the more capacity you have to read about these things. So in general, they're highly likely to care about these things. But even if you don't buy this, let's say they're complete idiots and things like that, they'll get canceled, right? There is a strong deterrent that exists right now for you to not do these things. So what is the implication of this rebuttal? The bar is already high. We don't need this additional thing. But secondly, I don't think their tool works. And it doesn't work for broadly 3 reasons. The first is people hate doing mandatory things. And this is very intuitive logic. And as we pointed out, and they concede that this will be something mandatory put out to them. They will ask themselves if they have all of the things they talk about, like having a job, like just going about your degree. Why are you having this feminist class right now that is disrupting the flow about this particular thing? Especially if your grades are dependent about this and you have a particularly egotistical incentive to hate on these particular things. But secondly, it is just a class, right? It is just a dust in the wind in this particular case. Even if it's multiple classes, it's just it will most likely get tuned out of the wide range of sounds and different classes that you have in many of these particular things. It's like a scene in a movie without the whole movie, right? This is like the same way with the Marvel scenes, right? Where they put a bunch of women there and they expect, oh, now we've made guys feminists and things like that. And it's very easy for you to simply diffuse from this thing if it's just a class that you are doing in this particular thing. But the third thing, what is their impact? Truly, what is their impact? Will you be X% smarter? What is the difference in the decision making that you will do in this particular case? Information without a change in the incentive structure isn't something that we particularly care about. And if they can't point out to a tangible impact to me, I truly don't understand the margin of their case. How does our case compare to these 2 things? And we bring you 2 impacts. And I'll be honest with you, these are high impacts. They happen in a high burden impacts. They happen in a small percentage of the situations, but we think the impacts are huge if they do. The first thing is we need intensive research to bring to the general population. These are things like statistics for domestic abuse ratio. This is things like statistics for gender pay gap. This is interviews with different victims and things like that. This is asymmetrical on our side of the house because we tell you, when you have a dedicated class, it's much more likely for you to have homework dedicated for this. It's much more likely for you to have a research project that is 40% of your grade when you're opting into this particular class and to doing this sort of thing. This is unlikely to happen on their side of the house when it's just a module and you can't put such particular focus on this. We think that this type of research still remains with the professor. They compound over the years, and in the end they can put out a report. This is important because usually they put out these reports in kind of like newspapers or the wider population. There's a shock value when you understand, okay, like it is this problematic, it is as problematic as they're making out to be. But secondly, we just need, the second way this is asymmetric is that we need to combine academics together. The friction thing that we talked about, where people meet with each other, they discuss potential future projects, they discuss things that are extremely passionate to them, and they start working on these particular projects, these particular news outlets. The second thing we need is career feminists, right? And here I like to give a debate example. Sharmila, right? She wrote a PhD about, I think it was sex work in this particular case, and it was a pretty damn good PhD in this particular case. You get more of these on our side of the house when there's a dedicated specific department for this that justifies the funding and the position and the like not the corporate, but the academic hierarchy that happens through this. These people have massive persuasive power because later they got, I'm a PhD in gender theory and I specialized in, for example, sex work. I specialized in human trafficking. I specialized in these particular things. And people believe these authority figures. This is asymmetrical from all of the other feminist advocates that exist. They don't have this credential, don't have this bias towards academics, don't have this expertise. They can go against the Ben Shapiro's, the Jordan Petersons, and go head to head against them and defeat them in this particular case. Before I move on, CG, yeah.
Yeah, so I think strategically you're correct, but what's unclear is why your departments and gender specifically will produce research that relates to the mainstream policy questions like labor employment, and why
I'll tell you because as opening government said, these departments are not idiotic. They'll most likely do the thing that brings the money, which brings me to the final thing that I need to respond to. Sorry, LJ, I won't take you, and you can't bully me into taking a POI. So why is this actually will lead to money? There are three reasons here. Firstly, there are many scholarships that will be given towards these type of people. So this responds to both why the department will have funding and the push from OG as to why people will be able to study these things. There are many funds that have ESG ratios. So like this is their corporate responsibility that would like to give money specifically to give for this particular thing. They can later put publicly, we donated for the course in Berkeley University about feminism, and this gave scholarships to women in this particular case. Secondly, employability. There is a rise in positions like gender experts or HR people that are responsible between gender dynamics, again, for the same reason, because companies want to be woke, they want to signal, they want people to buy out their products, they care about these things. By the way, these people have huge salaries apparently for doing these things, so it's very likely for these people to get cash and do this. But thirdly, the more of these courses exist, the more they the more research they do, the more they justify their impacts in this particular case. Why would they do research on gender pay gap and all of these things? Because it's the most adequate thing to do in many of these cases, because this is the most pressing issue that is communicated to them. If you're going to run ivory tower feminists and things like that, I truly don't believe that these people are. Even if they are, many people who are in the classes aren't. So this means that there is sufficient amount of revenue for these things. Ultimately, this debate is very simple. We don't care about the quantity or informing that to people as much as the quality to get to all of the other people that need to be persuaded. For all these reasons, oppose.
Take the DLO. Call on member of GW.
Can I confirm I'm clearly audible?
Yeah.
I'll take my POIs in the chat. Starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. CG's extension is simple. Teaching and inclusion is good if done well, but is of secondary importance when you compare it to research. 3 strategic observations that explain as to why if you get more research of higher quality and more funding specifically for feminist-based research, such as looking into the gender pay gap or differential impacts of different laws, it is the best and most important outcome in the round. 1. Top half teams agrees that unis are broadly leftist. All says that like oftentimes you discuss with colleagues where there's other pressures to be relatively woke. That probably means that university students are to some extent exposed on both sides of the house, and there's incentive to teach them about feminism. What's the true thing that can change is oftentimes what you do with policy research, because that's independent of what you do by teaching to students, and that's what actually has impacts that are going to happen. But two, it determines the extent to which students engage, because you can put it in all modules, but if what the gender department does is something that's different from what, for example, a mainstream law student or mainstream economics student understands to be good research or something that's interested or persuasive, they'll just never buy in and will think it's stupid leftist shit and never engage with it. Thirdly, I just think it's a clearer pathway to people changing opinions as compared to, someone tells you it's unclear how that turns into policy. Oftentimes research is commissioned directly for policy, so it matters more. Let's talk about research, but before that, couple of responses to O. I just think that most of the mechanisms they give as to why you hire more feminists or more women in academia just do not apply for the debate. One, oftentimes you still need feminist research to have to integrate within modules. That means that there's a demand for this research. And if it's true that women predominantly do it, you'll have incentives to fund women on our side of the house simply because you want the highest piece of research to fit with the quality of research of your whole module, because unis want to maintain the reputation of given flagship courses as being important in having the best research. But two, if it is true that there's all the incentives to have old male professors not research feminism, particularly for the response I gave before, that's why you have an active incentive, for example, in the economic department to hire females. But three, broadly, the instances where this motions apply is that where unis cave into the pressures to have more women in their department or teach more about women, it's just a choice of the departments to which they allocate the funding and the researchers. So I don't think they can claim that you get more researchers with the mechanization. So why do we get better quality, better research? Four broad strains of arguments. One, better production. Two, more people of higher quality enter the field. Three, research is more accepted for funding. Let's talk about production. Why are the insular departments of OO relatively bad? Notice that empirically, gender studies department often reject empirical-based research, which is why is required by a lot of government departments or NGOs to implement policies. They oftentimes reject the frameworks of other discipline and call it an operation of the patriarchy and can never fundamentally understand gender. Over 80% of research that's done by today's gender studies module falls into anthropology, a field that's oftentimes not cited by other departments. There's structural reasons for this. One, oftentimes if the courses are separate, the people before they develop a research interest self-select into the ones that think the mainstream is relatively bad, and that's why they pick the other feminist course. This happens less on our side of the house when it's integrated. But two, when you're not in a given department, it's more legitimate to criticize it, and you have an incentive to do it because you want to differentiate your own research and explain why the mainstream economic research is not good. This is bad for teaching and has to be changed on our side of the house, and we create impetus for change. Why do we create impetus for change? One, you need students to like and understand the module, so it has to be within the broad language of law that they're learned or economics that they're learned. So you have incentive to fund researchers within the economic department who approach feminism from an economic lens. But two, this is also good because now you get more discussion in the mainstream academic debate, just because you have to teach what courses most relate, for example, to employment policies and what courses we need to teach. The comparative is often better because, again, these teachers oftentimes apply and work in the mainstream, and you get more mainstream debates within academia. So output of research improves because more academics are debating with each other to understand what the best courses are. But there's also pressure to get the best courses, the best research, because you want it included in courses. And insofar as courses are something that's prestigious at the university, especially mainstream ones, it acts with the prestige and the law of academics we're passionate to have. So you get competition to get the best research, so the best one is put within those modules. But thirdly and finally, on better production, if you're included in the mainstream, if, for example, a women employment issue is in a general labor economics class, there are going to be more citations in the traditional field. So there's more incentive now to do the research because you don't only get cited by your own small department, rather you get cited by some of the biggest departments in the university and departments that exist in multiple universities. Most universities have econ departments, but most universities, not all universities have gender departments. Secondly, you get more people of a higher quality applying and becoming these researchers. This is true because oftentimes, if these courses are more prestige, if they're included into the mainstream things for what universities are known, because more universities are known for teaching economics or law rather than teaching feminism, you oftentimes attract people of the highest quality or more people because they know they're in a field that has more prestige or more exit opportunities as compared to just doing gender studies. So oftentimes you attract the best young researchers by knowing that there's opportunities in teaching these courses, and that just improves the research output of the university because better people come in. Thirdly, I just think like the perception and how people understand the research when it's put up is better because one, as I've explained, you move from like departments being perceived as a talking shop and radical as more integrated within policy because there's pressures for like the existing researcher to be pushed into integration with policy, so it makes sense to be taught in the classroom. But two, like the ministers and stuff who are educated are people who have at least internalized, because they do multiple education degrees, have internalized that like gender is somewhat important or somewhat to be considered because they've been exposed to so many classes, so they just like accept gender-based research more. But two, if it's true that some teachers, especially the senior ones, think that gender-based stuff is like bullshit because they're old and white, they're probably hard to convince, especially when it comes from a separate department. The way we flip OOS is oftentimes if it comes into the mainstream course, we explain that, the gender pay gap is not bad because insert like random anthropology words. It's bad because like insert language of economics, like for example, there's like market inefficiencies and stuff, which is something that like these professors accept because of the language and the way and the models they think, so they're more likely to change their mind. Finally, on funding, for all the reasons I gave above, why there's more prestige and the university has to make a good course, they put in more money. But two, notice that some like conservative people do not want to fund the gender department because it's stupid. They think like the economics department is better and they give it, think economics is better. And oftentimes when the mainstream department can take the decision, it can allocate funding to the smaller ones to like gender-based research as well. For all those reasons, CG.
Thank you, member of Gov. Call on member of Op.
1 second. The first thing I want to do in this extension is frame what good academic work looks like, because I think that a lot of what has been missed in this debate is why it is that the integration of feminist topics within courses themselves is fundamentally incompatible with the mode of producing new knowledge. If I can convince you that even if you have the best incentives and all the money, you can produce productive work, this will already be prior to what you've already heard from the other teams in the debate. Importantly, I actually agree with Stefan here. That is, it is the case that a lot of feminist theory does come from a very reactionary perspective, or like reactionary in the sense of being radical against the system as it stands. It comes from people like continental philosophers. It comes from like a reaction against the perceived patriarchy, and therefore it does tend to be very incompatible with existing academia. Rather than just agreeing with CG though, I want to give you structural reasons why this is true, which I think basically fills in the gap of what you already hear in opening opposition. Importantly, this is because to get good academic debate going, you need to be operating within a set of shared assumptions and a set of topics that you know you disagree on with each other on. That is, the more narrowly you can construe your disagreement, the better you're able to delve into it and figure out exactly what it is that you don't agree on. To give you an example here, if I were to tell you that I don't believe in God, it may be the case that you're about to engage in a theological debate. However, if I were then to follow the statement by telling you I don't believe in dogs either, you're far more likely to see this as a conversation that goes beyond theology, but rather about my very skepticism or belief in, things existing outside of me. In a similar sense, this is the exact brick wall that feminist academia runs into. Let me give you the example of law departments. I am in one. It's the case that even though you have students largely engaging in mainstream legal reasoning and operating on a set of shared assumptions, the issue is that when the feminist academic comes in, what they do is they fundamentally and wholesale reject the basis on which you're trying to reason. As in, they're not merely going to tell you that they think you're misapplying your values, but rather they're even going to tell you that the people who gave you those values may have been dishonest or like trying to push for an agenda in favor of men. The issue, I think, with this is that very trivially, this rejection is incorrect. That is, even if feminist academia has merits, which it does, it should not be happening to the exclusion and dismissal of mainstream academic ideals that do and have propelled humanity forward. The best way then is to keep the two separate to the extent that these conversations don't completely and naturally conflict, and let them interact with each other in a way that leads to positive academic discussion in the right context. Before I move on to my analysis then, I want to make three important pieces of framing that make much of what you've heard so far uncomparative. Firstly, given that the world has been getting more complicated and given that universities are incentivized to have a unique selling point compared to other universities, they have started offering more and more joint honors courses. What this means is that even the two departments are separate, you have many programs that allow you to basically interweave modules from both. Therefore, I think we can enjoy many of the same benefits. Secondly, for the reasons that Close and Goran point out, much of funding is probably uncomparative. That is, even if Rumen is right and you have corporations that want to do ESG, you presumably can do the same thing by creating a grant and giving the money to this department or that department and letting feminist academics from different departments apply to your grant for funding. It's never clear why it is that you need to have a separate department of your own to be able to access this kind of money. Never mind on the third point. Why is it then that it gets far worse in terms of the type of work you get on their side? There are four reasons here. Firstly, there's just not enough content to justify full academic positions for feminists in most fields. That is, at the point at which you're looking at someone who's both a lawyer and a feminist, in that this person is going to be a professor at the Department of Law, you need to reasonably expect him to be able to make contributions to both fields. However, for the analytic reasons I give you, it's very difficult to find a cross-section between the two, given how fundamentally they disagree. I.e., Stefan may be right that there are some policy outcomes you can look into, but if you're looking not at feminist results or feminist praxis, but feminist theory and critical feminist theory, it's very difficult to find ways to integrate this within departments themselves. The implication of this is that one, you're just unable to focus on this type of work, so you just don't produce very much of it, but also two, that you also drive away many of the women who care about these positions. That is, if you're a high achiever, you're unlikely to go for the spot where you get to do a bit of both, but not really in depth or in a good way. The second mechanism is that faculty becomes far more insular on their side of the house. The issue is that what you produce, what you publish, crucially depends on where you're publishing. That is, if you're a professor of economics or a professor of law, the types of conferences you're attending, who is peer reviewing you, and the topics you publish on are going to be inherently linked with your department. The issue then is that, like, one, you're effectively restricted in issues that basically solely concern one topic area and feminism, as opposed to being able to draw experiences from feminism as a whole and being able to use those to critique the different assumptions of the field you're in. But also, secondly, it's the case that this means that you're far less likely to get the citations that government wants. Exactly because you don't have this cross-referencing, it all becomes very shallow and very insular. Even if you have the goodwill, you need that department to be able to run conferences. If you don't have a space, if you don't have the organization, you simply don't get good academic work. Opening.
Back half is contingent on most feminist theory being so crazy that it cannot collaborate with other departments at all. This framing is insane and also knifes your opening. I don't think this claim stands in the debate.
Look, I'll deal with you more in WIP, but I think the fundamental claim here is that if you want to discuss feminist theory, this has to do with the different theoretical principles underpinning feminism. I think that this is not just the same as applying some of it, and you can shake your head all you want, Arjun. Third point, it's the case that you make appointments on a shallow basis on their side. And government is probably right that this is not because of sexism, but this is because of a fundamental lack of expertise by the people making these appointments. That is, these are the people running the departments who presumably don't want a whack job who's trying to claim that most of modern law doesn't have a basis in what it purports. You probably don't get the sort of holistic appreciation of the type of person you want. Fourthly then, why is it that institutes are far better? Firstly, you get genuine accountability for the academic proposal you're proposing. You get the conferences, you get the peer review, you get the ability to have people who disagree with you. Even if opinions are wacky, and government is right that they often are, it's important to properly consider them and dismiss them rather than just see them as being excluded as a result of none of these academics getting into any of the high-profile posts. By putting them all in one space, you can have a proper discussion and conversation about these ideas. Importantly, you get feminists from different strands of feminism itself. As urgent POIs, it's true then that you get people who are more moderate who can explicitly challenge these ideas and dispel the notion that feminism is useless. That is when you're able to have proper discussion and conversation within other fields. More impacting in WIP. Very proud to oppose.
Take DMO, call on the GovWhip.
Hi, just checking my audible. Great. Okay. POIs in the chat, please. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 parts in this speech. Firstly, I'll defend the extension and integrate responses to closing opposition. Then I'll weigh us off against our opening. And then finally, I'll deal with opening opposition. On to the extension then, and I think why is it winning us the round? Firstly, what did Stefan tell you in terms of the way production of research is going to happen? And here's where I want to respond to closing opposition's claim that inherently a structure of research that has an integration model is just incompatible with what is considered good research. I think Stefan already framed to you at the top of his speech that the way research works on our side is that you have the feminist lens and you're applying it to a field of study. What this necessitates is that obviously individuals who work under academia on our side need to have some base knowledge. So I think this also responds to closing opposition's assertion that there's just not enough content to justify permanent positions on the academic boards. Why? I would suggest that in order for you to even be able to apply the feminist lens to begin with, likely these academics would need to understand base content. We can see there might be some time that's needed to be spent for these academics to perhaps learn about economics, for example, if they're now going to work under the economics department. But I think that this is unlikely going to be a massive problem given that, academics are smart people, they can learn things quickly. But I just want to do a little bit more work here and suggest that it's the flip. I would posit more people are actually incentivized to enter the field of academia now, especially once they're grounded in feminism, when they have the promise that their positions have occupational mobility. I think the reason as to why many individuals are hesitant to even pursue academia to begin with is because the things they do are relatively niche. What this means is that under a publish or perish culture, many academics are scared, or at least many prospective academics are scared, that if they are unable to generate ingenious ideas within a short span of time, the careers are made redundant. This changes on our side, because when you work in the mainstream, you don't necessarily always have to publish articles that are grounded in feminism, because the integration into the mainstream allows these individuals to perhaps apply feminism to a certain extent, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the focal point of the article. I think if anything, there's just more individuals working in academia on our side. Lastly, I think if there's just more demand for such feminist literature in the mainstream, there's going to be a need for you to continue to have these individuals work in your academic departments. So I think individuals still are going to remain unemployed on our side. The last thing I just want to deal with is just this fringe claim on how appointments are going to be extremely shallow. But I think this is just largely uncomparative, right? Because even if you're the mainstream academic, you can't just discard secondary pieces of academia, because I think that just reflects badly on you in terms of an academic professional. So I think largely this claim is just assertive. I'm unclear as to why it's so bad on their side. But I just now quickly want to weigh this off in terms of our opening bench. 3 reasons as to why I think our extension weighs us over opening government. Firstly, the problem with opening government's case is that it significantly relies on the educational experience of how, when you do things like integrate feminism, more individuals learn about it, and this is good. I would note, I think opening opposition is correct to point out that opening government never properly deals with why the educational experience is going to be received well, or like how exactly you're going to deal with backlash. Uniquely, our extension of better quality research is independent of the student experience, because as closing opposition also rightfully points out, likely most of the majority of research that's ongoing about feminism happens in the postdoctorate or like postgraduate stages, so there's limited student interaction there. Secondly, our reasons for funding increasing are more plausible in terms of how universities generally gain funding. So funding is not so much based on the student experience. Like, people don't look at how many percentage of students are happy in the University of Oxford before they decide to put their money into investment projects. More often than not, funding is contingent on the research quality more so than the student experience. So insofar as we've proven that the quality of research is far superior under an integration model, because generally more people are incentivized to buy into it, I think that is where we're able to secure more funding for these departments in order for them to actually expand the opportunities that individuals get. But thirdly, in terms of the reception of this academic work, we explain why uniquely at the point in which feminist academics do things like co-opt the language of mainstream academics, that is when you force discussions to happen, because it deals with the problem that exists in the status quo. More often than not, unfortunately, a lot of feminist academic work gets boxed out because of the notion that it is far too radical. We shouldn't even engage with this because it's just merely talking. There's no actual tangible solutions provided. At the point in which you co-opt the language of the mainstream, you force discussions there. That in of itself is a net good. Before I deal with opening opposition, sure, POI.
Professors don't grow on trees, they come from high-performing students. Where do prospective feminist academics flourish more, economics or feminist courses?
So I'm really unclear to the point of this POI, right? I think you can also become a really good feminist academic, even if the majority of what you studied was economics, right? Because like, ultimately, the feminist lens can be applied on a scale. You don't have to be 100% feminist for you to be a good feminist, like academic. You can be 75%, 25%. I'm not going to go into the numbers, but I don't think that you need to only study feminist literature in order for you to become a feminist academic. Let's deal with opening opposition in three main ways. One, I just want to explain why jobs are empirically going to be lower on their side and why this is an exclusive harm they cannot get away with. One, feminist departments are actually just quite small in the status quo to begin with. So opening government says stereotypes exist, but unfortunately, they don't explain what the impact on these institutions are. Just look at the status quo. Feminist departments have constantly experienced things like pay cuts, downsizing over the last few decades to the point where many are redundant in academic institutions. If you look at LSC, unfortunately, the Department of Gender Studies gets a shitty building, whereas the economics department gets the most like fancy and like largest building on site. I'm going to give you two new reasons that opening government doesn't give in terms of why we should weigh us over them. One, when these institutions are extremely small, it doesn't matter if the degrees, as Elo says, is easy to obtain. Because if funding is so limited and everyone explores their own niche, it's quite difficult for you to even get a job to begin with, which is why many individuals self-select out of the process. Here's the comparative. I think when it's integration, the type of research opportunities we afford are far more because you're no longer contained to your individual department. You can work in the economics department, you can work in the physics department. The opportunities are endless. Secondly, will the reaction to this integration be bad? And OO operates on quite a radical characterization here, right? That people will reject something because it's imposed onto them. But like, per their own characterization, if the universities engaging in this motion are pretty woke and left-leaning, I think many individuals are progressive and open-minded. So I don't think they're going to have as adversarial of a reaction to something being forced down their own throats. I would just frame really quickly that Stefan already told you, probably the integration of feminism isn't going to have it be the focal point. It's largely going to be subsidiary. So the level of backlash is going to be minimal because not like so much time is going to be taken out just for you to learn about feminism. And opening opposition is quite soft-line here. When they respond to the POI, which is saying, you can do research that brings the money in. Guess what? The things that bring you money are the mainstream content because it's the highest in demand, but they just inherently cannot do this because the focal point of research on their side is the feminist aspect. It is not the economic or legal problem, which is what we uniquely get on our side. For all those reasons, vote CG.
Thank Goblet. Call on Opwit to close out the debate.
Can you hear me again? Okay. One moment. Yeah, this is my sixth speech for the day, so let me All right. Easy structure, CG, OG, OO, in that order. Firstly, the response to my case. The issue with the responses you do get is that there is a fundamental misunderstanding of the analysis I do give you. First thing we hear is that academics need to understand the base content of what they're teaching, and that this means that the course is not going to be shallow. I want to note two things here. The first one is that when I say that the appointments are going to be shallow, this isn't a criticism of the academics themselves. Rather, it's a reflection of the fact that there is only so much that you can discuss within the paradigm of the field. And to point out, most undergraduate degrees discuss the mainstream paradigms within the field itself, as opposed to going to the fringe, before you can find enough cross-section with feminist theory itself. That is, other than getting through the very trite propositions of things like we shouldn't be sexist or we should support women, if you want to get into the theoretical element of where it is that these things socially come from, getting into psychological theories that tend to be very controversial, for example, it's very difficult to do so without rejecting or very heavily challenging the mainstream within the field. I will note that this is conceded by a member of government as well, so I'm very puzzled by Whip giving me a response to the contrary. In particular, then, the issue is that even if you do get a professor who understands these things, they won't have the remit or the funding or the time to discuss these with students or to publish in these areas, given that they're a professor within their field and need to focus within their field, and therefore you're not able to discuss these issues with sufficient depth. But also, secondly, it's not clear that you're going to be willing to offer like full defenses of these positions to your students yourself. That is, for the reasons that we already hear, you presumably understand that it's the case that your students don't appreciate such a radical departure from what they've already heard. Therefore, you're basically preaching to an unwelcoming audience for a sort of curriculum that isn't very likely to appeal to the majority of them in the first place. Next up, it's the point I give you about who makes these choices. When it's the department heads who are part of their fields and part of the mainstream tradition, I don't think that it's an issue of malice, but one of fundamentally understanding what it is that feminism wants. Presumably, you want someone who can discharge their capacity as a dual professor well, i.e. someone who can help both with economics and with feminist work within the department. This is the CG case as well. This is a very narrow cross-section in that even if Stefan is right and you get these publications, those are all you get. If I can convince you, you get those on either side of the house, the rest of the case presumably becomes uncomparative. Why is it then that CG's case doesn't work and you get those publications and students going into feminist theory on both sides? There are three reasons for this. Firstly, joint publications are far more popular. Given that fields have been specializing, you're not going to need a single professor who fully understands both fields. What happens is you get someone who's primarily a feminist theorist, who also has some understanding of law, with a law professor that has the opposite proclivity, basically. And when you get this sort of match, they can both contribute for their part of the article itself. When you get this sort of cross-section, you're far more likely to get a wide range of beliefs in a far better paper than you would on their side. Secondly, though, individuals tend to branch out in the work they do, right? I don't think it's the case that most individuals are going to go in and do an undergraduate in feminist studies, but rather you're likely to either do a joint honors, as I said, or start out from a field like politics or sociology or law or economics, and then go into feminist studies, which is understandably more narrow when you do your master's, when you do your PhD. And that is exactly when you can specialize. At this point, then, it's the case that you're able to access this type of research on both sides of the house. However, I'm going to go a step beyond this and prove why it is that you fundamentally get more and better research. And this has to do with addressing top half. I'm going to demonstrate why the quality clash is more important than the quantity clash, both in A, persuading people, but B, getting the funding for these publications in the first place. I have three reasons here. And importantly, note that OG basically asserts that the exposure you put these students to is going to lead to good reactions, i.e. they're contingent to the idea that the professors are going to be good and teach these things well. I've already analyzed why this is not the case. Three reasons here. Firstly, student perception just largely depends on the quality of the work you're engaging with. When you don't have these feminist academics who can dedicate themselves to the fields and produce good work, you're likely to have short excerpts, things which don't connect to each other and don't seem consistent, and which are presented to you half-heartedly by a professor. The issue here is that especially when these works often like disparage your field, or rather they tend to be so surface level you don't really see the point in them, you just don't get the sort of positive reaction you want from students and the public. The second reason is that famous academics often go a long way to winning public support from your field. When you talk to someone on the street, they will never have heard of the joint professor who has done both things. Rather, people tend to in one area, and it's when you have the separate departments and conferences you can access this. Thirdly, though, you're far more able to persuade people in other fields when they can see the entirety of your theory. You can justify what you're saying to them, you can point out all the different aspects of what it is you're proposing, as opposed to it just being very fragmented. What this means then is that even if they disagree with you, they can respect with where you're coming from, and you're far more able to have more detailed and nuanced pieces of work. This results in more funding, because when work is more analytical, per OG's concession, that's when you get better results from it. That's when it stops being surface level and merely seen as lip service to what is required by the progressives within the university. The second reason that this is better than quantity, however, is that in the long run, this is how you're able to persuade people to create more positions, give you more money to do this research, to continue hiring more individuals, and to have a meritocratic appointments process, as opposed to having an appointments board that doesn't fully understand what feminist theory is about. At the end of this weighing, then, you should believe that even if we get fewer academics in the short term, this is going to lead to better quantity in the long term. Next up, then, I think that this so far has dealt with the opening government claim insofar as their contingent the characterization I have now disproven, and I think it deals with closing government in flipping them. Finally, let's weigh off against opening opposition. The OO case basically hinges on this idea that you're going to get more women academics as opposed to having men teaching these subjects. I think government are correct, however, to point out that you are unlikely to be having men doing these things to begin with. That is, you presumably have women on both sides, you presumably have a large degree of money on both sides. I think the crux of this debate is discussing the issue with feminist theory and why it is that it may be incompatible with these other fields. That is, my extension beats government on far stronger grounds, in that even if I concede the government point that you have the money, and even if I concede the government point that you do have goodwill, I prove to you why you cannot do productive academic work when your work is isolated, you don't connect with other fields, and you have to basically distract yourself from the main academic points you wish to be making. For all these reasons, I don't think it's possible to get this work done, and I'm very proud to oppose.
Thank OPWIP. Thank everyone for a very solid debate. This is a closed round. Cool. Hi, everyone. I guess you'll be watching this once you already know the result, but I will go through it just for the sake of clarity. So for this round, the call was as follows. We gave the first to closing opposition, the second to closing government, the third to opening opposition, and the fourth to opening government. So let's start with the top half, and then we'll get into bringing in the closing half teams. So we get two main contributions from OG. The first is a bunch of some decent, some less strong framing about reasons why joined gender mainstream will be done well. So reasons why universities kind of like generically care about students learning, etc. Some stuff about why universities are like left-wing woke environments, and then some reasons to frame why people won't always self-select into choosing gender studies courses, just because there are requirements, because there's some degree of social stigma, although we're not clear like exactly the extent of these barriers, but like they certainly exist. And then some framing that we're a little less compelled by even on face before we bring in the other teams, which is just like there are enforcement mechanisms to make these discussions good, like I don't know, get expelled for hate speech, which just to the average reasonable voter who knows like universities have standards for academic freedom, seems like it needs way more discussion or proof that this is true or even desirable, or like is that not a reason why students won't take these courses, like so so on and so forth. So like some framing to establish that you have baseline effectiveness, and then argumentation to the effect of discourse is good because more people hear about feminist ideas to a degree. Some good framing actually about why universities are diverse environments. Not everyone comes in woke, but may emerge woke if they learn more about feminism. We think that OG is short on two big things just on face. One, clear and specific impacting about what they learn about uniquely in these courses that brings them so many benefits. And second, clear discussion about what actually happens in these classrooms. Like there are some illustrations, especially in Deputy, about the feminist angle on like transitional justice or Afghani households and so on, but very little specific work to show why understanding or knowing this is so important for every student across all fields. So it's just a depth problem on face to the argumentation. And that becomes particularly important when you're challenged by OO, who make a variety of solid arguments. So, well, actually, logically, just in order of OO, they start with by far their weakest argument, which they also heavily pivot away from in DLO, which is reasons why there'll be male professors hired, which to me relies a lot on the implicit idea that it's, there's some structural reason behind it, that in the absence of your policy, lots of male profs will get hired because of biases, because of unequal opportunities, which may be true on some level, but I think as both OG to a degree and mostly closing gov come back with, the university environment, especially as OO concedes itself, is like kind of already woke, kind of already left of center. These biases are probably not as strong as being illustrated by OO. And it's not clear why those biases are less necessarily applicable in your world. That is, the analysis that OO relies on here is the hiring that gets done on gov is by departments that are less gender focused, which is probably true on some level, but you also think that universities are like sufficiently woke that the problem that's being solved isn't as big. So the sweet spotting of like how woke universities are and why there's a differentiation of leftiness in hiring compared to subject matter is something that I'm not clear on from OO. What I am much clearer on is good analysis that's done from OO about why people like just good reasons why people will disengage from the material that they're being taught on gov because they're being forced to do it, because it's kind of an addendum to the degree that they're not open to it, they're not interested, the quality of discourse and discussion isn't as good. I wish that OO illustrated what this would look like more and why the classroom environment wouldn't be as effective, but there's certainly analysis to show that people aren't open, alongside, especially in deputy, quite good mitigation of the OG case that establishes reasons why A, the knowledge that they get isn't necessarily as important, B, why they have other means of accessing knowledge outside of the academic context, which might be more useful, like via women they know, or just like post-Me Too era context and all that kind of stuff. And so I certainly take away that the problem being solved is less significant. What I weigh positively from OA then, over OG, is number one, that there's a greater degree of depth and celebrity and perceived authority to gender studies departments. And I think that the impacting of this admittedly is somewhat weak, as in I'm not exactly sure what this greater depth is doing, what the Sharmilas of the world with the capital that they have are uniquely teaching, especially if you believe that it's sort of like a post-woke moment, and what the unique importance of that discourse within academia is. But I certainly do take away that the relevant types of feminism that people want to self-select into and care about do get a bit more centralization. There's also a second argument on funding, which I do think is sufficient to prove something relative to OG, who in my view do a pretty weak job of responding to that claim, other than like people will eventually become less biased against feminism via their policy and then become more open to funding it. I don't think it's a claim on funding that ultimately stands up too much on OP, in the sense that there is a mention of forces like ESG that will give scholarship to gender studies departments, but that just seems very small on face, and there's not any actual explanation about why that's a big force, not like, let alone empirical, not structural explanation about why that is a large and important force, why that funding goes directly to universities and so on, especially next to the empirical evidence that both OG and CG supply, that gender studies departments tend to be somewhat small and more niche, especially in your world. There's also mention of the idea that there's employment in these fields, like gender experts or HR, but very little connection of that material to why it's comparative, because obviously like those jobs exist on either side, and the availability of the Gov response, obviously, even though they don't make it, but I'm just saying like the analytical gap is that Gov could just as well say, people will be less mad about having to take gender classes if they know that there are gender related jobs that are available for them. So I don't think there's a ton of effort to make it unique. I understand there's a strategy where you can marginalize that and say like that is equal on both sides and win on something else. And that will become relevant for the closing half clash, because I don't think you succeed in winning on that other thing. But next to OG, I do think it is sufficient because you've done quite a good job of deconstructing heavily mitigating impacts already made by opening government. The deputy does some work to explain why the scope of the backlash is smaller, but I do think that the DLO comes back, explains reasons why the people who are likely to backlash are relatively powerful, why the addition of grades in the academic context changes things to a degree, and so on. And I understand the weighing that you don't have to prove all of your impacts because they are high burden and high impact. My issue is not that they are fully unproven. They are weighted to an extent in the abstract from OL. it's actually that I don't think the illustration of why they are so high impact is sufficiently done by OO. So I'm weighing over OG, but I'm not fully compelled about the size of the impacts just on face before we even bring in the other teams. Closing Gov. I think Closing Gov does two really, really good things. Number one, they explain reasons why there are significant prestige and funding gaps, which are socially created between departments. And I appreciate the fact that you're LSE students and you know a fair bit about this, because like obviously the LSE has that problem. So basically, there's much more credibility and corporate backing and social respect and desire to take classes that are like economic, and also the way that feminist disciplines have been formed has been reactionary against the dominant perspective. They tend to write in a way that like the approach that they write in all through is just utterly unrelatable. You bring them together, there's now some incentive both to change the way that they approach things so that they can get cited by those larger departments and be direct opportunities to collaborate with those departments. And so the perception shifts from they're radicals to they become more integrated, both interpersonally, academically, in terms of publishing, etc. And they get to carry on and cross-cut with some of the prestige that other more powerful academic institutions enjoy. They also provide some better incentives analysis than OG does. So some reasons, for instance, why feminist research is needed, because universities recognize that they want to be perceived at the top of research. There's an opportunity here to be better than other universities and offer these courses that other universities are. So there's like some competitive incentive that universities have against each other. And I think it actually becomes an active impact as well, that you might get better, more empirical, less sort of soft anthropological research, even though I don't know if you'd necessarily weigh that component of the case as much as you could have to make it even more powerful. What I do take away, though, is that the field, which would be tempted to sort of self-segregate, does that less in your world. And rather than sort of remaining a radical force that other students don't want to take because it's oppositional to their fields, becomes more connected and integrated into other common fields. I think that does a couple of things to the OO case. One, it just shows that the level of anger that students have is less because the fields are consciously and appropriately integrated rather than viewed as a radical imposition. Second, in WIP, they add quite a lot of good reputation to OO. Like A, universities are probably already woke to a degree, so the extent of the imposition isn't as large. B, quite good responses on funding, like empirical evidence that universities right now have big funding gaps, reasons why fields like econ are more socially important and get more donors, etc. And then also some good response about why to become like a star academic, like the Sharmilas that OO was discussing, you don't necessarily need to have studied econ at the undergrad level. And the reason that's relevant for OO is that literally their impact in LO and DLO has a lot to do with like undergrads going deeper on the topics and specializing early on. But the response made by both CG and also the direct weighing in CO suggest that like higher level research is ultimately the most important thing. Both closing half teams end up pursuing a strategy relative to the top half, where they argue that the hiring margin is smaller due to the ideology that universities already have, their social objectives, the credibility that women enjoy on both sides in teaching this stuff, and argue that the effects on research are larger. And that makes it a somewhat bigger problem that what CG is doing to OO is mitigating and marginalizing the material on hiring and on like women's status, and then winning on research gets more high profile and potentially is done in better and more field integrated ways, which is quite well impacted, quite well weighed in the WIP, and beats OO for that reason. It beats OG because it actually much more specifically proves a characterization about the way that academia functions, why people actually listen rather than tune out, why they don't view it as an excessive imposition, and much more clearly impacts why there is social utility to connecting together frameworks and having useful, rigorous empirical approaches to fields that otherwise wouldn't get it. I think that there could have been a bit stronger impacting of this, especially in WIP, from Closing Gov, and that could have potentially helped you to beat Closing Op if you show like what the unique utility of this cross-cutting research is in a bit less abstraction. But given the problems I've already illustrated with OG, failing to prove much significant impact, failing to prove that there's a unique benefit that comes from internalizing this knowledge, CG is much further ahead on an accurate conception of the academic fields and on precise impacting, and then does a lot of response to OO that OG misses out on in the DPM. For that reason, they're ahead of both of those teams. Bringing in Closing Op. We think Closing Op does an excellent job in this debate, like truly very, very good job at explaining the way that actual like gender studies and academia is structured, and as a consequence, why the best case versions, as they frame themselves at the top of the Gov material, even with good hiring, even with good incentives, aren't likely to emerge. The reason, and you know, like I like what they do here, where they say like, look, the CG is right about the framing, but there's a different implication from that framing, is that you need to have a degree of academic sameness in order to have useful debate. Completely different fields that operate from very different assumptions about what is empirically true, about what framework for understanding goodness and reality and so on, won't do very well at interacting, and only will interact in a set case where people want to self-select, like the joint honors students or like the professors who manage to collaborate and publish together in a smaller set number of cases. But when they're sort of mushed together, the feminist field just become marginalized relative to them, because they get squeezed out of the academic job market, because it's hard to justify full positions when you're like an econ or law prof and you don't publish at the same rate as the top econ and law profs who don't do the feminism part as well. And second, that they're like less respected and struggle to actually engage in the discourse very well, because their views on like the legal system and its justness, or their views on the way markets function, are very diametrically opposed to the dominant paradigms which exist, which limit their freedom in the field, because if they want to succeed in the field, they feel a pressure to accept those paradigms, which is kind of what CG is arguing. And B, it just makes it literally difficult to have useful academic debate, and therefore useful research production, and honestly, like useful teaching and stuff. They also do some good framing to explain why the majority of the impact of that research and the margin of the debate probably isn't on undergrad teaching. We are not having like super critical levels of depth on either side, maybe some research projects, but probably not a lot. But there are also ways that people can specialize into gender women's issues if they're interested in the gender or women's angle of like law or econ, and then do a master's in that field, which seems like pretty good mitigation as well, to further justify why the self-selection mechanism that OA is discussing actually works. So this is also a much better version, incidentally, of the OO argument on pushing women away, because it proves that women who are like, you know, law and gender studies profs or econ gender studies profs will be at a disadvantage in their main field, because the gender work won't be appreciated in that field and will hold them back from publishing and reaching the top of their intended mainstream field. And so they'll kind of become a jack of all trades and master of none. This content, combined with the specific stuff about why critical feminist theory like has fundamentally different paradigms and pretty good explanation about why that is true, not just assertion, but like good structural reasoning, ends up being quite powerful. And then they have good mitigation as well about why when there are institutes, they can host like opt-in conferences where people who disagree can disagree with the choice to opt into those disagreements, rather than forcing people together who won't have useful discussions. And like authors who choose to collaborate can do so. They also get a higher profile, which I think is unfortunately somewhat derivative of what OA has already said, but they've maybe unlocked a greater set of those impacts, even though they try to claim the impact as their own erroneously. We do get some good response to that from Closing Gov. So they explain that like more radical institute stuff just doesn't get mainstream priority. I think CO does enough to prove that they can like force their way into priority. And I think you could say the equal problem for Closing Gov, which is a lot of Closing Gov is reliant on this line, which I've already noted, which is that inside merged together gender mainstream fields, their academics are forced to engage with the feminism. But that response in wit falls flat in my view, because they don't actually explain why they are forced. Especially if the paradigm is less respected, because it's less empirical already for the reasons that you illustrated. So I'm just not entirely sure how many cases you get to piggyback on the prestige and get published, versus CO claiming that you probably won't get published as much, and providing, I think, somewhat deeper and more compelling reasons for why that is so. So to summarize, CO beats CG by effectively responding and flipping their extension. They beat OO with good explicit weighing about what their material unlocks for OO in terms of the argument on hiring, which they prove better about how they fall through the labor market and women do worse, even if they get hired to a degree on both sides. And they have much clearer characterization about the incompatibilities, which goes beyond the gaps that I've identified in OO in the hiring argument, in the argument about how students get upset and backlash and so on, which I think CG also beats relative to OO. CO beats OG somewhat transitively of beating Closing Gov, but also specifically because they do call out the impact problem. They do explicitly weigh over what remains from OG in terms of generically informing students. And they also explain why like total discourse provided in the policy discussion ends up being more important than some students having more knowledge, given that OG hasn't done much to explain why the average person having that knowledge is so important, even next to OO's pre-existing mitigation, which is why they already couldn't beat OO let alone CO here. So very, very solid debate. Great job, everyone. If you have particular individual questions, feel free to let me know. But that's the RFP. Good luck for outrounds should you make them.